Today on North Carolina Law TV, David Daggett, injury and disability lawyer from Daggett Shuler Law out of Winston-Salem, talks to us about workers' compensation.
But modern workers' compensation laws, as we know them today, came about after the Industrial Revolution, mainly after World War II. Before that, we had what we called sweatshops.
Sure.
Those were the days of child labor and that sort of thing. And the common notion is that laborers, your manual laborers, were simply interchangeable parts. We would throw them on what I would call the scrap heap of life. Now, your employer pays workers' compensation insurance, but there's a limited recovery under workers' compensation because the injured worker also gives up their right to bring a liability claim against the employer.
That's all next on this episode of North Carolina Law TV. Workers' compensation is the idea of compensating a worker for injuries sustained while on the job. This is a concept that dates back to the days of Hammurabi's code in 1750 BC. We can trace the progression through history, the rise and fall of the popularity of having workers' comp in different societies. But by and large, the majority of our societies have had some sort of established system that affords compensation to people who are hurt or killed while working. Today, every state in the United States has workers' compensation laws to protect employees and employers, as well as their families. When workers are injured on the job, they and their families can suffer. Medical costs can quickly skyrocket. Victims and their families can struggle to make ends meet because of the loss of income. The system also protects employers from being overwhelmed by having to pay out of their pocket for their workers' injuries. Workers' compensation is a crucial part of our legal system today, but is also a complex one that is often confusing to many people. David Daggett is here today to talk to us about the ins and outs of workers' compensation law and to answer some common questions. David, thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate having you.
That was quite an introduction. I mean, that's complicated just in what you were reading out with your introduction to the show.
Well, it's interesting how long the workers' compensation has been considered. And has it always been, before workers' compensation in the United States, what did you see?
Well, I don't know much about workers' compensation and going back to Hammurabi's code, but modern workers' compensation laws, as we know them today, came about after the Industrial Revolution, mainly after World War II.
Okay.
Before that, we had what we called sweatshops.
Sure.
Those were the days of child labor and that sort of thing. And the common notion is that laborers, your manual laborers, were simply interchangeable parts. We would throw them on what I would call the scrap heap of life if they got injured or hurt at work. What happened is workers' compensation laws came around, like you said in the introduction, to protect both the employee and the employer. So the way it works is if you're injured at work, you don't have to prove fault or anything else. If you're injured at work, you're entitled to workers' compensation.
Even if it's your own fault or a coworker's fault?
Even if it's your own fault or a coworker's fault. Now, your employer pays workers' compensation insurance, but there's a limited recovery under workers' compensation because the injured worker also gives up their right to bring a liability claim against the employer.
When do they give up that right?
By virtue of the statute and by virtue of being employed.
Oh, okay.
So you cannot, quote, sue your employer if you get injured at work.
So that's where it protects the employer.
And protects the employer too.
As well.
Now, you know, it's interesting. You hear the political debates and you hear people on both sides. You don't hear anybody talking about there's two sides to the story. From the employer, there's two sides. For the employee, there's two sides. Workers' compensation is to provide some benefits to the employee who's injured at work, so we don't throw them on the scrap heap of life. And it provides a level of predictability and protection for the employer who's just trying to run their business.
Sure, Sure.
Okay? So workers' compensation provides a limited recovery. Typically, it's 2/3 of your income,
Okay.
up to a certain amount, and pays for your medical expenses. That's good news for the employee.
Sure.
They don't have to worry about getting medical treatment, and they get 2/3 of their salary while they're out.
Okay.
For the employer, they know that in advance, and they don't have to worry about liability claims and that sort of thing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That's right.
So it's a limited recovery system that puts some predictability in it for both the employee and the employer. Now, where they can get really, really complicated and really, really difficult is if you get injured at work and your long-term income earning ability is impaired.
Right.
That makes it a more drastic situation.
Right.
The laws get much trickier and much more complicated. That's where you
Okay.
need some experienced help involved.
Okay. So
I jumped through that pretty quick. So.
Well, so let me see if I understand. So so if it's a shorter term thing that you're covered and the company's covered.
Yes.
And the employer is covered.
Yes.
But if it's longer term, then there's a lot more questions. There's more laws involved. There's more of a.
Well, what happens is typically if you have an injury, you recover, and you go back to work.
Right.
You don't need lawyers involved. The system should take care of itself. Okay?
Okay.
If you have a more severe injury that impairs your long-term earning ability, that's where the laws get trickier and more complicated. And certainly they should, because you've got responsibilities. If you can't go back to your job or have to take a lower paying job or can never work again, that's a completely different story because you got to protect yourself and your family. And there's laws there to do that. They're just very complicated and they're very tricky, which is why you need somebody that's got a lot of experience to help you through that process.
To help you navigate it so that you can be protected in the long term.
To navigate the system for the long term. That's
so
correct.
It's really good to hear at what point in an injury, if it's going to be long term, that you really shouldn't be handling that yourself now, or it would be helpful to have someone who knows how to do it.
Right. If you have permanent injuries, permanent medical treatment, ongoing care, maybe need wheelchair or some other accommodation, or can't go back to work ever.
Right. So it sounds like, or if you have a job that you can't do that type of job anymore.
If you can't do that type of job anymore.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's really good information. Is there anything else that you think we should know about this before?
I think the important thing is for injured workers to know that they do have rights under the system.
Right.
And they need to know who to turn to and where to go to get their claim handled in the proper manner.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing that with us.
Well, we only had a short amount of time. It's complicated, but we only had a short amount of time.
Well, thank you. Thanks. It's very helpful. If you or someone you know needs assistance in this area with workers' compensation claim, you can call David's office at 336-724-1234. Until next time, this is Nancy Hollett for North Carolina Law TV.